Good morning, Professor Steve E. Miller, not to be confused with Steve Miller.
Yes.
And good afternoon to our European audience. Thank you all for joining this European Context online conversation, understanding US foreign policy priorities and global security challenges, Iran, the Middle East, the Arctic, Greenland, and beyond. We are delighted and honored that Professor Miller has accepted our invitation to help us better understand current US security policies and their broader global implications. Stephen E. Miller, is director of the International Security Program at Harvard University, editor-in-chief of the quarterly journal International Security, and co-editor of the International Security Program's book series, Belfer Center Studies in International Security, published by MIT Press. Previously, he was Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, and he taught defense and arms control studies in the Department of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Miller has edited and co-edited more than 2,000 books, including most recently The Next Great War, The Roots of World War I, and The Risk of US-China Conflict. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where he serves on the Committee on International Security Studies and co-directs the Academy's project on the global nuclear future. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I curate and moderate European context events and work with two Vienna-based organizations, Forum Journalismus und Medien, a training institution for professional journalists, and Presseclub Concordia, a press club founded in 1859 and still active in defending press freedom. European Context is generously supported by the Austrian Erste Foundation. The format today of today's conversation is straightforward. I will conduct a 30-minute conversation with Professor Miller, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session with the audience. The audience can turn on their cameras when they ask a question or do it through a chat. It's really up to you. Given the intensity and immediacy of current events, there is little need for a long introduction. Let us begin directly with the latest developments. Let me start with today's developments. The United States announced, or President Trump announced, that starting 4 o'clock European time or Central Europe, it means right now, he'll start blocking, or the US will start blocking the Strait of Hormuz. He has confirmed that a US blockade of ships, there will be a US blockade of ships entering or exiting Iranian ports. My first question is, how will he enforce it? The strait has not been fully closed, as Iran has allowed some tankers to pass in exchange for substantial tolls. How would the US determine which vessel have complied with Iranian demands? Would force be used against foreign flagged ships and ignore the blockade that ignore the blockade? And how might major stakeholders such as China respond? Can we start with your evaluation of this immediate situation, and then we go to a broader question? Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us.
Sure. Well, thanks for that kind introduction. And hello, everybody. It's good morning from Boston, Massachusetts. What we've seen in recent days is the Trump administration struggling to find some leverage point that would enable them to achieve an escape from the mess that they find themselves in. It was just a short time ago that Trump was threatening to destroy Iranian civilization. They were relocating forces from Asia, ground forces, intimating that they might take over Karg Island or do some other sort of ground-based operation. None of this has worked. The negotiations over the weekend obviously produced nothing at all, nothing of consequence, but nothing at all. If you looked at the American 15-point plan and the Iranian 10-point plan, there was essentially zero overlap between those two uh, starting points. Each represented maximum demands, and there were almost no points of overlap. So it's not at all surprising that nothing was achieved in Pakistan. But a different way to think about it is that President Trump, between his first term and his current term, has been president for 5.5 years. In most of that period, he's been trying to achieve a so-called better deal with Iran, and he's never achieved even a single scrap of agreement, despite lots of effort and lots of attempts to do so. If 4.5 or 5.5 years was not enough to reach a deal, what was the likelihood that it was going to happen over a weekend? Uh, Meanwhile, there was this frustration in Washington that Iran's control of the Straits, which did not involve, as Mariana said,
Miriana.
Mariana, sorry, said, didn't involve complete closure of the strait. The Iranians have no incentive to block their own oil shipments, and they've been relaxed about friendly shipping, provided a toll fee was paid. So the view of the Trump administration was Iran is disrupting the world economy while still being able to benefit in a large way financially from the continued export of their oil. And of course, they ship about 2 million barrels a day of oil, and much of it is destined for China. And that connection was maintained. So in the aftermath of the failure of the weekend negotiations, Trump has decided we're going to block Iran's ability to export. And in that way, they at least won't be able to benefit financially from the current situation. But there are two complications. One already mentioned is that this could be tricky operationally. A carrier battle group is not set up to enforce a blockade. We do have some smaller combat vessels, but not many in the area. We've been keeping our naval forces parked out of harm's way, not in the Straits of Hormuz, out of fear of Iranian anti-shipping missiles. So this could be a little more difficult than one might think. But the second point is the main effect of us blockading the Straits of Hormuz, that is to say, between our efforts and Iran's efforts closing the straits off completely, is that it will take another 2 or 3 million barrels a day of oil off the international market. And this is sure to be disruptive. This is sure to produce more volatility in the prices. It's certainly going to upset the Chinese, who are the principal recipients of Iranian oil. So it's not clear how well this plays out, even for the Trump administration, even if they're able to effectively enforce the blockade, because basically we will be creating a cork that completely blocks up the straits. And this will mean that the oil that has been flowing will no longer be flowing, and the disruption of the oil and gas market that has been dramatic enough as it is will become even worse. So this may be a sort of own goal for Trump if it plays out that way.
And what will be the consequence for the rest of us? Because we don't know if this ceasefire will halt or the war will continue. What do you see as the immediate, does anyone have any planning in Washington? Does anyone do any planning? Or it is all like a moving target?
Well, firstly, I would say that there hasn't been a real ceasefire because there was never full agreement on the terms of the ceasefire. The Iranians have been insistent that all had agreed that southern Lebanon was included. There's a second front in this war, and the Israelis have been acting very aggressively in southern Lebanon. So the Israelis never completely opened up their part of the strait. on the grounds that the ceasefire was actually not being observed by the Israelis. I think this is a terrible problem for Trump because the Israelis have different interests than the United States. They're eager to take advantage of this opportunity to weaken Iran as much as possible. The more that this current war looks like a very, very rare opportunity to damage what they regard as their most dangerous enemy, uh, they're going to try and do what they can as much as possible, as long as possible. So Netanyahu has been quite outspoken that the ceasefire does not apply to southern Lebanon, which means there's a complete disagreement about the conditions associated with the ceasefire. I don't think the Iranians ever fully complied with their promises because of this. So what we've had is a partial and not fully agreed upon ceasefire. And the key part of it is that the United States has ceased with its 800 to 1,000 bombing attacks, sorties in Iran every day. And the sense here is that Trump is looking for an exit. This has been a very costly exercise. He's identified, depending on the day, any one of a handful of different objectives. Unconditional surrender, we're nowhere close to that. A complete surrender by Iran on the nuclear issue, they have refused to do that. No more support by Iran of proxies. Well, they're disrupting the ceasefire in order to back Hezbollah in southern Lebanon at this very moment. Regime change in Iran has proven to be disastrous in the sense that what's taken over, as near as I can tell from what's available in the public, is about half dozen, a small team of about a half dozen who are drawn from the most hard line of the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, including people who were sidelined by the elder Ayatollah Khamenei because they were too extreme. So we have replaced one Khamenei with another, and he surrounded himself by people who are even worse for our interests than the people that we removed from the picture. You know, one of the telling moments was early in this war when Trump was asked whether he would negotiate with the new regime and find more congenial leaders in Iran. And he said, well, we hope to do that, but we've actually killed all of them. You know, there are multiple ways in which we have been not effective at advancing our own interests. So the point is, the objectives have not been achieved. The costs have been dramatically higher than were anticipated at the beginning of this war. It's quite clear that Trump and Netanyahu expected 48 to 72 hours. They thought Iran was on the verge of collapse. They thought they would give it just a giant shove, a violent strike, and the whole system would come crumbling down. They thought that the puppeteers were the elite, surrounded by the original supreme leader, and if we cut those cords, the whole system would just come crumbling down. That turned out to be completely wrong. And so now what do you see? Everybody who'd spent 5 minutes thinking about it understood that the Straits of Hormuz could be or probably would be closed. Why were our minesweepers in Asia? The United States has a small number of minesweepers. They're in Asia. If you were thinking sensibly about this and planning appropriately, you would have moved those into place. Why did the Trump administration have to wait 3 weeks for a Marine brigade to move from Asia to the Gulf in the middle of the war? Why weren't they there from the beginning? Because they expected
And why? What is your explanation? Why?
Because they expected this war to be over in 2 days. They didn't expect to have to clear the Gulf. They didn't expect they would need to threaten ground invasions. Meanwhile, I've been occasionally calling this war the Trump-Hegseth plan for self-disarmament, because all these 800 to 1,000 missions that Hegseth boasts about every day are consuming very large quantities of our very expensive and not easily replaced advanced strike systems. They're wearing out our planes. They're wearing out our crews. We've misallocated our naval power, pulling carrier groups out of Asia to put them in the Gulf to prosecute this war. So the point is the costs are mounting. You know, it costs $50,000 an hour to fly our aircraft, our military aircraft. It costs millions of dollars a day to have a carrier deployed in a hostile environment. So this is the picture that Trump has in front of him. And so what they can say is we've destroyed the Iranian Air Force, which they do. This is Hegseth's litany. We've destroyed their Air Force. Iran's Air Force was filled with pre-1979 combat aircraft. They've been cut off from global arms markets since the revolution. The Iranians themselves call their Air Force a flying museum. So and this war, it demonstrated that both the Iranian Air Force and the Iranian Navy posed no significant threat to the United States military, that we've eliminated both of them rather effortlessly. So the Air Force and the Navy are gone. We've hit a lot of missiles and a lot of missile launchers, but not enough to eliminate the Iranian missile threat. We've gone after Iran's defense industry, but not enough to prevent them from manufacturing lots more drones. And so one way of looking at it is we've dealt a terrible blow to Iran's military. And there's a sense in which that's true, but the problem is that's not connected to the achievement of our political objectives. But it also is the case that what we've destroyed is nearly 100% of Iran's capabilities that don't matter. And the capabilities that do matter, which is to say their missiles and their drones and their resilience, we have not been able to reduce those threats. So Iran still possesses the ability to do significant damage, limited but significant damage in Israel and on the Arab side of the Gulf. And so that means when we threaten to escalate to hit Iran's energy infrastructure or their desalination plants, for example, Iran explicitly responds by saying our policy is tit for tat. Whatever you hit on our side, we're going to hit on their side. And they've demonstrated that they can hit the natural gas facilities. They can hit, as they've done in Qatar. They can hit the oil facilities, as they've done in Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. They can hit the desalination plants, which they've done. All of this they've done on a limited scale. But if they were to do it on a larger scale, we would not be looking at a short-term interruption or disruption of the energy markets. We would be looking at multiple years of very high price oil and natural gas and real scarcity with associated concerns about helium, about fertilizer, about petrochemicals. So the Iranians have real escalatory leverage there. And that means it's hard for Trump to find levers that coerce the Iranians to make concessions that enable him to declare victory and quit. But I think that's what he's aiming for. And I think this American blockade that just went into effect is the latest effort to find a lever that will lead the Iranians to accept something that produces an outcome that allows Trump to declare victory and move on.
Do you think that if there is an escalation, Europe or NATO might be absorbed into a war? Or NATO can maintain so far, can remain on the side?
Well, Trump has discovered that spending years criticizing, offending the allies, threatening to withdraw our security guarantees, launching a tariff war with them, and so on, was not the ideal path to gaining Allied cooperation when he wanted it in this war. And my sense is that there's very little will uh, within European capitals to get directly involved in this war. They've resisted Trump's rather heavy-handed pressures to join in and do something. He, of course, vacillates between saying, we don't need the help, but we're furious with the Europeans because they won't help. So there's an odd contradiction in his posture. What I think is likely to happen is you know, the way the global oil market works, a lot of the oil that's in circulation is actually at sea, and the vessels move very slowly, and so it's weeks from departure from the Persian Gulf to head around to Asia and to fuel Southeast Asia or get your oil to China or whatever. So the price spikes and volatility that we've been seeing are really market driven. But now we're going on 6 weeks now. Much of the oil that was at sea has now been delivered. Because the straits were blocked, some of those routes, they don't have a long pipeline, a sea-based, system. So we're starting to see scarcity. And that will also have an effect. There's the stories coming out of India about shortages of natural gas. There are stories about several Southeast Asian countries that are, within a week or two of depleting their energy reserves and so on and so forth. If this blockade really dislocates the market, this is going to affect Europe. This is going to affect China. And I think the way you're going to see intervention is there's going to be enormous pressures on Washington and Jerusalem to stop this war, because the macroeconomic consequences for the global economy will just intensify, and it will become more and more painful for all of these states, including NATO Europe or EU Europe, whatever Europe you want to think about. It will become more and more painful to just be an innocent bystander as the Israelis and the Americans prosecute their war.
Well, but do you think that all of these countries that will soon experience, and some are already experiencing scarcity, have the leverage to influence the US and Israel?
Well, I think small Southeast Asian states don't, but if it's Europe and China, uh, there's if anyone has leverage, they do. Now, if there's one thing you can say about Donald Trump, it's that he doesn't respond like a typical political figure, and he sometimes bridles when he thinks he's being pressured or hassled. So who knows how this guy would respond? But that's if the question is how might NATO come to play a role in this war, I would think the most likely way is things get so bad economically that they begin to try and twist Washington's arm to bring this thing to an end. The only other scenario would be if the Iranians did something incredibly stupid, like firing weapons into NATO countries. That would be a profoundly costly mistake for the Iranians if they did it. But they did fire a missile to Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean, so they do have some capabilities to hit targets in Western Europe if they chose to do so. I can't see any sensible scenario in which Iran would see that as in its interest. But I think what they're trying to, if you look at this from Iran's point of view, you have a couple of huge and disturbing lessons. The main one is that your air defenses were more or less worthless. They were in both of the wars in June 2025 and the current war. very easily suppressed by the Israelis and the Americans. Your airspace is basically wide open to air attack by the Israelis and the Americans. It's very well known that the Israelis have this so-called mow the lawn strategy, which is they go in using force, they weaken their adversaries, things calm down, they go back to normal for a while. When the adversary starts looking stronger again, the Israelis go back in with force and they mow the lawn. They did this repeatedly in Gaza before finally just pulverizing Gaza in this latest wave. But so if you're Iran, the big question is, how do you deter this in the future? How do you guarantee that June 2025 and February, March 2026 don't turn into April and May of 2027 with the third Iran war, right? And the answer is you have to create some sort of deterrence. And what that means is that they have every incentive to protract this war and to make this war as costly and disruptive as possible so that the next time somebody's thinking about attacking Iran, which, as we've seen, is very easy to do for Israel and the United States, the next time Washington and Jerusalem, next time Bibi and Trump get together in the White House and cook up the idea for another war, somebody says, do you remember what happened last time? Do you remember how costly that was? Do you remember what leverage Iran had on the global economy? Do you remember what they did to the Straits of Hormuz? Do you remember that they were hitting Saudi and Qatari major fossil fuel facilities and could have done much worse if they chose to do so? Right? That's the deterrent threat that Iran is now building for the future, because this is the main way they have to protect themselves against future assaults. Given that they don't have what little air defense they had is gone, it will take years to build up something better. But the Israelis and the Americans are very good at suppressing air defenses, so that's not a reliable shield behind which, once those are gone, basically the U.S. Air Force is engaged in target practice in Iran. We can hit anything we want. So they have a big problem, the Iranians, and the solution is make this war as costly as possible. And I think they've been pretty effective at doing that.
Before I open the floor, the screen for questions, we are. I know it is a very short time to address all the burning issues, but I would like to go for a second or to the Arctic. And I understand that President Trump has not forgotten Greenland. There are conversations going on right now that the US wants to expand its presence on the island. According to the 1951 agreement, they can do it. But I would like to ask you, could you just tell us what is the main strategic importance of the Arctic beyond what all of us have read, like that once the ice melts, there will be more commercial routes. We know there are lots of minerals, but deep sea mining is very costly and very complicated. And I'm not really sure if there is the technology yet. I understand that out of 8 attempts for mining in Greenland, I think there were Chinese, 7 have failed. So, what is the real strategic importance of the Arctic when it comes to cables and satellites? Why does Trump want the Arctic so badly? So do the others, so do the Chinese, but the Russians are already there and they have their nuclear warheads there. What is the main reason why the Arctic is so important?
Well, we this opens up a big topic, and I'll try to do it justice, at least a little bit of justice, quite briefly. You've touched on some of the geoeconomic factors, which includes transit routes, sea lines of communication as the ice retreats, much shorter to go through the northern route from Rotterdam, say, to Shanghai than to go the other way around. Much, much shorter, so you save a lot of money and time. I would say the main geoeconomic consideration in the Arctic is actually oil and gas. The U.S. Government in 2008 did what was called a circumpolar Arctic resource assessment. It went by the acronym CARA, C-A-R-A, and it came to the conclusion that there are Persian Gulf quantities of oil potentially in the Arctic, mostly but not entirely in the Soviet, Russian Arctic, but also in portions of northern Canada and northern Alaska, overwhelmingly offshore. It will be high-priced oil, so you have a question of expensive oil in a world of much cheaper oil. At present, the infrastructure is limited for extracting and exploiting, marketing and monetizing Arctic oil and gas, but there's enormous volumes. If you look at the last Russian Arctic strategy white paper, it has a preface signed by Vladimir Putin that says, "The future of Russia lies in the Arctic." And I think that was largely connected to the fact that when it comes to Arctic oil and gas, Russia is Saudi Arabia. Now, there's a huge question about the value of that oil and gas in a world of global climate change, worries about greenhouse gases, dramatic improvements in renewables, and so on and so forth, and the difficulty of exploiting expensive gas and oil when the world still has quite a lot of less expensive oil and gas. But that is a huge consideration. And in the aftermath of that report, what you saw is a lot of scurrying around by the Arctic states trying to clarify maritime boundary disputes in the Arctic, because it suddenly might matter where the line was drawn, because that might affect whether you did or did not have, the resource access, the rights to exploit the oil and gas. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But there's a military strategic dimension to the Arctic that has at least two components. One is that we've entered an age of accuracy. We've entered an age in the strategic nuclear world where land-based targets are basically vulnerable. Even mobile missiles, because of improvements in surveillance, are increasingly vulnerable. So it's really the sea-based forces, the ballistic missile submarines on both sides, which are the bedrock of their nuclear deterrence posture. And in the case of Russia, most of their sea-based nuclear capabilities based on the Kola Peninsula. And they deploy that in Arctic waters and the Barents, and to some extent even under ice. So that's known as the bastion for the Soviet Russian ballistic missiles. They had exactly the same strategy in the Soviet period during the Cold War. And the Norwegian Sea becomes the big buffer that protects the Russian bastion from assaults by the U.S. Navy and associated NATO naval capabilities. So in our strategic thinking, the United States, the Battle of the Norwegian Sea becomes a critical variable because it determines the extent to which we can threaten Russian ballistic missile submarines. For Russia, this is an absolutely vital issue because those submarines are the heart of its deterrent force. They're the most survivable element. And so if you think nuclear deterrence is critically important, which certainly Moscow and Washington do, this means the Arctic is a major strategic arena. And the Russians put a huge amount of effort into defending it. Their entire Northern Fleet basically is devoted to defending the bastion. And the United States spends billions of dollars buying assets whose purpose is to penetrate into the Soviet bastion and give us some ability to to hunt down and, if necessary, destroy their ballistic missile submarines. So in that sense that you have a critical arena. Then there's one further point, which is with respect to land-based forces, the trajectory of Russian missiles against targets in the United States goes right across the Arctic. This is the main azimuth of attack, as it's known. And what this means is that the entire U.S. land-based early warning system is deployed in the north. There are dozens of radar stations. It's called the North Warning System, NWS. It's in the Arctic. It's essential for giving us warning of missile attack, and also, by the way, drone or cruise missile attack. It's linked to satellites because we now have a lot of satellite surveillance. And the easternmost component of that is Greenland. So there's a major radar station, American-based, with a key radar station in northwestern Greenland. And then if you look at
sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to make one more point and then I will shut up. But so if you look at Greenland on a map, you have this radar station, but also if you remember what I said about the Battle of the Norwegian Sea, so Greenland is adjacent to the northeastern edge of the Norwegian Sea. So it's an important coastline. So there's a geoeconomic component and a geostrategic component to the significance of the Arctic. With respect to Greenland, I would make one more point, which is the Trump administration seems to have, in a not entirely clear and explicit way, adopted a kind of spheres of influence strategy for the world. And so Russia might have, the Russian periphery, the Chinese might have East and Southeast Asia, but the Western Hemisphere is American. And if you look at Greenland, it's interesting. The line between the European command and North American command used to lie just west of Greenland. And the United States has changed that to incorporate Greenland into the North American command. And I think this is in part an effort to kind of consolidate this vision of the United States as a kind of utterly dominant actor in its sphere of influence, which is the Western Hemisphere. And a lot of the stuff that he's done in his second term, Canada as the 51st state, Greenland as a necessary American possession, crushing Cuba, which they're in the midst of trying to do, eliminating Maduro. This is all about homogenizing the Western Hemisphere, eliminating the trouble spots, maximizing American influence in the area, and so on and so forth. That's kind of an aside from the Arctic, but it explains, I think, a little bit about Greenland.
The Manifest Destiny. Well, I will start reading. There are 3 questions I'm going to read, and then you can also raise your hand and ask them live. I will read all 3 of them. Margarita is a journalist from Portugal. The first question is, the Atlantic Alliance is based on the premise that an attack against one country is an attack against all. Article 5 has only invoked after September 11th. In this case, there was no attack against the NATO country, so why would they enter the war? What legitimacy does Trump have to make demands of NATO? Question 1. Question 2, from Isabel Ioannidis from Eliamep in Athens. Is the G7 still a useful venue for managing transatlantic relations, or has it become more of a stage for diplomatic posturing? Is it still a relevant forum for cooperation? How might the EU European leaders try to use the upcoming G7 meeting in Evian to keep Trump engaged in Ukraine, trade and defense cooperation? And the third question is rather interesting for Tamara Sil from the Austrian public broadcaster, and I quote, general question: what role do movements, narratives of peace play nowadays? and what role should they play? Go ahead, all easy questions.
Okay. Uh, Hello to Portugal. My older son and daughter-in-law live in Lisbon, so it's a place I have great affection for. Uh, your observation is exactly right. NATO is a defensive alliance, first of all. Secondly, it's preoccupied with Europe and the defense of NATO European member states. And so an offensive war in the Southwest Asia is not an organic issue for NATO, and particularly when uh, the allies were not consulted. I believe they weren't even informed in advance. None of them see this war as being in their interests. And in addition, they've been treated quite badly by Trump. And so it's very hard to see. There's no legal obligation for sure, and it's very hard to see what other incentives that the NATO allies have to participate in this war. The G7, uh, the G7 is a structure which can be uh, valuable or worthless depending on how it's used. And the problem we have at the moment is that Trump and his team have utter contempt for international institutions. He's withdrawn the United States from 66 different international institutions. The purpose of the G7 was to facilitate collaboration among important, powerful actors, and to try and harmonize positions on issues of common interest. The Trump administration is devoted to a unilateralist foreign policy. They prefer to deal always bilaterally because the United States always has an asymmetric advantage. And they have very little interest in international collaboration. And they have zero interest in fact, negative interest, I would say, in the kind of issues, the global commons, right? Climate change. They not only aren't interested in cooperating, they deny that it's even an issue. So, if anything like the current context, I don't think that the G7 has a whole lot of value. And you can see this when Trump shows up late, doesn't attend the meetings, leaves early. One of the recent ones, he left in the middle of it. The story that was printed in the newspapers was that he got bored and just decided to leave. So you can imagine with a different president and a different context, the G7 could still be a useful device. But at the moment, I don't see how it can be particularly valuable because there's no will among the most powerful within the most powerful country to use it for any particular purpose. You can see that Trump attaches very little value to bringing people along with his activities. He doesn't put a lot of effort into persuading people. He attaches essentially zero value to notions of soft power. You may have noticed there was a recent quote from a TV interview by the person that I always think of as the unfortunately named Stephen Miller, the, in which he said, "We live in a realist world. It's all about power. We have enough power to do whatever we want. Others have no choice but to come along," and so on and so forth. Well, this is one of the two or three closest people to the president. This is his worldview, and this is how they've been behaving, right? The the general operating principle of the Trump administration is we can bully people into submission. And when
Can
that
he
doesn't,
bully people into submission?
sorry?
Does this principle work to bully people into submission?
Well, we're seeing one test of it in Iran, aren't we? And also, as you see the growing tide of discontent in Europe, and so on. Sometimes it does work, and it's the same way he operates domestically, and he, at least for his constituency and his allies, he runs roughshod over them, and it does seem to work. But You know, in the Iran case, for example, during the first term, Trump famously pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, in May of 2018. He and Pompeo launched a campaign that they called Maximum Pressure, heaping sanction upon sanction upon sanction, trying to bring Iran to its knees. And Secretary Pompeo published a famous article in Foreign Affairs laying out the Iran policy of maximum pressure. They identified 12 objectives. And by the end of the administration, they had achieved none of them, 0 for 12, right? And one of the reasons is, because I was involved in various Iran dialogue activities, so the Iranian perspective was the proper response to maximum pressure is maximum resistance. And Iran had the view, its elite, that making concessions under pressure like that would be disastrous because then there would be no end of it. Every time Trump wanted something, he would just apply pressure. And so you had this odd paradox that the more pressure Trump put on Iran, the less capable they were of making concessions.
May I ask this beautiful question about peace movement? I would like it for the end. Maybe there will be something positive to say. I would like to ask Simon Weiss first, and then you, Tamara, to ask your beautiful question. Simon is, I know him, so he's a security expert in the German Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Simon, go ahead.
Thank you, Mariana. I have two questions to Mr. Miller, one about arms control in general and one about the Arctic security. I mean, it's striking how quietly we seem to be entering a post-arms control era in both in the nuclear and the conventional domains. So given the tempered US response to the termination of the New START treaty, are we like entering a prolonged phase of strategic deregulation? And how long do you think this phase will last? And what do you think will eventually bring the major powers back to the negotiating table? And the second question, you already like explained the strategic importance of the Northern Fleet to Russia's strategic posture, Russian security. So, what are the strategic consequences of NATO's expansion to include Finland and Sweden for Russia's military presence in the Arctic in general? And how vulnerable is Russia's Northern Fleet? And is there a realistic prospect of Moscow relocating key assets to the Far East, like to Vyluchinsk, Kamchatka, or other like strategic naval bases? Just to like increase the depth between the NATO-Russia along the NATO-Russia contact zone. And last like question regarding this Arctic security and arms control in general, because it's connected to this. Could Russia sustain a renewed conventional and nuclear arms race with NATO, even if the alliance becomes more European in nature, so without the US? What do you think? Thank you very much.
Three big questions. I don't know how much time we have, but I'll do my best to
we have 10 minutes, but in 10 minutes we have to include the question about
Right.
peace.
Right. Well, your first point, Mr. Weiss, about arms control is exactly right, and I share exactly your concern. I would say that we've seen a secular trend that started with the Bush administration's withdrawal from the ABM treaty in 2002, 2003, away from arms control. And there have been a few exceptions. New START was one, the JCPOA was the other. The one has been allowed to expire, the other was ruined by withdrawals. But otherwise, what we've seen is much more dismantlement and elimination of arms control than creation of new structures. It used to be if you went on the OSCE website, it would say that the pillars of European security were INF, CFE, Open Skies, and the Helsinki Principles. Well, the first three are no longer exist. And the Helsinki Principles, I think Mr. Putin has gone 10 for 10 in violating them. So what's left? What are the pillars of European security today? That's basically rebuilding NATO military capability. And I look at the broader sweep. We basically had from about 1960 until 2000, we had 4 decades with some interruptions, but more or less continuous effort to build an architecture of arms control that constrained and shaped the strategic nuclear forces and that imposed on Europe a kind of restrained architecture of dialogue and reassurance. And we've had now a quarter of a century in which most of that has been demolished. And we are, in fact, back in an unregulated environment. For the first time in 50 years, since the expiration a few weeks ago of New START, the strategic nuclear ballgame is unconstrained by agreement. So the constraints, and this touches a little bit on your third point about Russia and the arms racing, but the constraints today are budgetary and technological and maybe a little bit political in the United States. You have to mobilize to spend all those hundreds of billions to modernize the force. In the United States, I think the consensus of the security elite in Washington is that New START was no longer in the American interest because the numbers were too low. And the reason for that is the Chinese buildup. And as long as the United States has a counterforce capability, that is to say that we target the weapons of the other side in order to give ourselves damage limiting options, every one of those Chinese silos, and the Pentagon is estimating maybe 1,000, but certainly there are hundreds in play already. Every one of those constitutes a target. Every one of those targets usually gets at least 2 warheads to ensure that you have a high likelihood of destroying the target. Every one of the warheads in the American arsenal, deployed arsenal today, is already targeted. So you need more warheads to take care of the Chinese. And there is an argument that basically says, well, we have enough to take care of Russia or China, but in a future war scenario, we can't disarm ourselves vis-a-vis one by fighting a nuclear war with the other. So you might think this logic is crazy, but or that these scenarios are unrealistic, but these are the kinds of worries that are driving things. So we're seeing comprehensive modernization across almost all the nuclear weapon states. They're not all harmonized in terms of timing. The Russians are a little bit ahead, but the United States currently has what is now in round numbers a $2 trillion 30-year strategic modernization program to comprehensively replace the entire nuclear arsenal, the entire triad. The goal is to have this in place by 2050, and this is the arsenal for the second half of the 21st century. That's the ball game we're in. Arms control is not on the agenda, except Trump occasionally says we need a 3-way deal with the Chinese and the Russians. The Chinese have been, they couldn't be more clear that they have zero interest in force posture arms control. So as soon as you say we need a triangular deal, at least for the moment and for the foreseeable future, that's just a complete non-starter. So I think we are in what you might call an arms control free zone for the time being. I think the place to start rebuilding arms control might be in Europe. It might be restrictions associated with whatever settlement we eventually arrive at vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. But then there's going to need to be an effort to rebuild a European system that consists of more than Russia being ugly and us arming ourselves. That's the current system. So on Sweden and Finland. So Sweden and Finland together are larger than Ukraine. It's a very large territorial expansion of NATO. They have much larger chunks of territory that are very close to the Kola Peninsula, very short flight times if we put NATO air power up there. There's already some risk of that from the Russian point of view because of bases in Norway, although those bases are not in the far north, which would be both very difficult to operate but also very vulnerable. So ours are down the trunk of Norway, so to speak. But also surveillance, drone operations, etc. There's a lot of things that if you were in the Russian shoes, you would worry about with respect to the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. Both Finland and Sweden have signed defense cooperation agreements with the United States. Both of those defense cooperation agreements give the United States right to, in both cases, something like 12.5 bases and facilities on the territory of Finland and Sweden. Some of those are in the southern half and are southward facing. Some of them are in the northern half and northern facing. The other implication here is that with Finland and Sweden in NATO, the Baltic becomes a NATO lake, just completely surrounded. And both Sweden and Finland have considerable Arctic optimized naval capability. So the balance of naval power in the Arctic is very significantly affected by this. And if you look southwards, air power and naval power based in Finland and Sweden give NATO a much more significant capacity for short response activities if the Baltics are threatened. So there's a kind of southern dimension and a northern dimension, all having to do with northern Europe.
And the last question, please, something nice. Tamara, would you like to repeat your question, or I've read it already?
Yes, what role do movements or narratives of peace play nowadays, and what role should they play? Because in my opinion, there's no voice of peace. Like, we're always talking about investing into weapons and defense systems, but there's no antithesis. Do you know what I mean? What do you think about that?
I think for quite some time we've been in a political environment that has been quite permissive with respect to the use of force, and you don't see anything like the anti-Vietnam protests. You don't see anything like the tremendous, in the early 80s, the tremendous movement backlash against nuclear buildup. There was something called the nuclear freeze movement in the early 80s. In their most prominent moment, they had 1 million people in Central Park in New York protesting the nuclear policies of the Reagan administration. And in the current environment, you've seen a little bit of backlash particularly against Gaza on American campuses among sort of progressive groups in the U.S. But in an event of the day, we started with what happened at 10 o'clock this morning. Perhaps the sweeping away of Orban is a symptom that things are beginning to change a little bit. But in the United States, to be honest, it's been quite a discouraging phase because President Trump is president and will be president, provided his health stays intact until 2028. He has enormous power. He's very willful. He's largely unconstrained by laws and norms. He's lost dozens and dozens of lawsuits because he's arrogated to himself powers that he doesn't constitutionally possess. But he acts until the lawsuits are resolved, and then when he loses the cases, he appeals, and in meantime, much of the damage is done. So this is a quite unhappy setting in the United States. The positive in it is when you take the whole package, the tariffs, the wars, Trump has used force now in 7 different countries. He's had 2 wars with Iran, right? He's almost weekly attacking little fishing boats in the Caribbean. You have $10 billion U.S. aircraft carriers killing some hapless little fishermen off the coast of Venezuela. 2/3 of the American public is now opposed to this. He's the most unpopular president in the history of American polling. He has numbers like Richard Nixon during Watergate. So there's a lot of frustration and vexation. But the caveat always is he's president of the United States. He's very powerful, and he does what he wants to do. I'm sorry, that's not very uplifting.
Well, the uplifting is that we shall invite you again, provided we have electricity, provided we have energy,
right.
and that we are alive.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really hope we have the pleasure to talk to you again, because we addressed huge topics and we had only 1 hour. I thank you so much, and I hope you can be our guest again. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'd love to do it again. I appreciate the invitation, and thanks to all of you who joined in and listened.
Great. Thanks.
Take care.
You too.